Well, why don't we go ahead and kick this off? So, first and foremost, I want to welcome everybody for joining the Cloud Identity session sponsored by Sonrai. What Eric and I are hoping to accomplish today is kind of help dispel some of the confusion on, what's the difference between an identity, a persona, an entitlement, and an account, and how we can roll all these concepts up into a broader idea that you guys can digest and take back into your businesses to be able to help figure out who has access to my cloud and who has access to my data in the cloud. And so why don't we go ahead and start with introductions. Eric, would you like to go first?
Hey everybody, I'm Eric Kedrosky. I'm the CISO at Sonrai Security. At Sonrai, we believe that identity and data security should be at the core of your cloud security strategy. Who I am, I've been doing InfoSec my whole career, and I've spent probably the last 8 years doing security in the cloud. So really happy to come and talk to everybody about what we're seeing. This is new to everybody. And so please throw your questions in the chat. This will be so much better. And I said that, there's no stupid question, just put them there and we'll be happy to answer them.
Great. And my name's Mike Brewer. I'm security architect here at EVOTEK. I've been with EVOTEK for about a year. Prior to that, I spent about 22 years doing cybersecurity and enterprise architecture for the federal government and the private sector with a main focus on identity and access. So looking forward to the conversation as well. And echo what Eric just said, please, we want to make this interactive. It's more of a fireside chat. So the more engagement that we have from you all that are listening, the better this will be. So just kind of jumping in and help set the stage. We want to be able to, again, articulate the differences between all of those different terms, right? An entitlement versus an identity versus an account. So, Eric, what are you seeing on your side as far as customers having an understanding of these differences and the potential implication of tracking things in the old way of, here's an account, then I can give rights to whatever I need to versus, how the cloud is structured?
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's a bunch of paradigm shifts and all of the vendors haven't helped in this. In the cloud, we tend to now think of accounts as something like an AWS account, the thing that you build in, or a subscription or a tenant in Azure or a project or organization in Google. So we tend to use the term account in that way. However, when I'm talking to a lot of security people, a lot of CISOs, they'll still use the word account to mean a lot of times a user. And so, one of the terms that you see in the cloud a lot is the term identities. And identities can take on two forms: your traditional account, your user, your Eric, your Michael, your Jane, your John, whoever. But we also have these non-person identities. These are things like your roles and your service principals and all these other identities in the cloud that aren't your traditional user. And so we try to first break it apart and set the grounds of what we're talking about. So for today, when we talk about it, we'll talk about identities, and we'll talk about them as people identities, which you might traditionally call an account. And we'll talk about those non-people identities, which are your roles, your services, those other things. That's what I'm seeing a lot of in a lot of the education we're doing.
Yeah, I definitely echo that. When we talk about people that have been in the data center, not going into the cloud greenfield, they do have those service accounts. They have those admin accounts. And a lot of that gets lost when they start to adopt some of the cloud structure, because now their marketing team or maybe the financial team is worried about the cloud account. And that can kind of get confusing when you're talking about, well, why do I care about that account? I only care about my admin having access. And so it's kind of changing the lexicon for how we're doing things and monitoring things and what we actually care about and what are we tracking on when we start to adopt some of these cloud things. So, how are cloud kind of changing that kind of structure, Eric? I mean, we're seeing before we would have like admin accounts and user accounts. Now it's kind of, you have one identity and that thing can do a lot of things if not properly managed.
Yeah, I mean, you still have those traditional things like traditional accounts and groups and whatever. But really what we're seeing is the non-people accounts are really the big change in the cloud. Again, they're your AWS roles or your service principals. Their services themselves can have identities. And so these are really the things that are really taking over in the cloud. And it's actually the things that are doing the work. Michael's not going to log in and most of the time spin up a whole bunch of infrastructure under his own user account. He's probably going to use an AWS role. He's probably going to use a service principal to do this. This is what drives a lot of what goes on in the cloud. But what we're seeing is that, especially for teams that came from a data center to the cloud, and listen, I was one of them too. I wasn't born in the cloud. I came that way. We spent so much of our time developing programs for, PAM and access management around users and service accounts, that when we went to the cloud, we spent a lot of time focusing on only that, while a bunch of DevOps teams were over here and over there and over there building workloads using the tools of the cloud, which are the non-people identities. And so, stuff just ended up working. And as a security professional, when you started going like, wow, we really should pay attention to these non-person identities. Why does it work? Well, you realized it worked was because the role that runs the workload was given full admin privileges. And it's like, of course it worked, right?
Yeah.
But this is where a lot of organizations get themselves into risk that I say they're not aware of. They're not aware of these risks because they're still like, oh, Michael's locked down, he's fine. And that's one of the risks. I want to bring it back though to, you asked about entitlements at the start, and we didn't get to that. And what's an entitlement? And I think I like to think of an entitlement in the cloud as not just the entitlement that you, Michael, are given as the user, but when I look at any identity, the end-to-end permission that identity has. And so why it matters and why I kind of wanted to pop that back in was, so think about it this way. In the cloud, if you're only focused on watching those users, those service accounts, sorry, I go using the term, not those people identities, right? You might say, oh, Michael's in a group and he's fine. His entitlements are okay to the group. What you might not realize is one of those entitlements that Michael has might allow him to now use a non-person identity. So I'll quickly use an AWS example, but it's pretty analogous across the clouds. The user Michael might be able to then assume a role in the account, that he's in, the AWS account that he's in. And now he's got a different set of permissions. He's got his original set, and now he's got the permissions of the role that he has. And so now you start to see those end-to-end permissions starting to build. Well, what I see a lot of is it starts off rather harmless, where Michael's in the right group and it looks fine, but actually he can assume a role, which allows him to assume another role, which allows him to assume another role. And his end-to-end permission goes from Michael, the user in the dev account that can't really do anything, to Michael's true end-to-end permission being he can hop from dev to stage to prod and access really sensitive data. And so you can see how the scope of the problem very quickly and the risk grows very quickly. And then again, coming back to it, what I see is that a lot of organizations are struggling with the beyond Michael being in a group and the next hop, and they don't see that whole chain and they're unaware of that. And so they're going off somewhat blind saying, oh yeah, we're good from an identity perspective, until someone comes along and says, but that Michael doing this, that, and the other can hop right to prod. And then you talk about multi-cloud, and the same example applies. I've seen examples where a user in one cloud hops into Azure, which can then hop them over into their GCP instances. So
Right. And I think that's an important part to kind of have that distinction with non-person accounts, right? That can actually mean a image of an Ubuntu server, right? That server itself can have rights to do things, and because Eric's account was able to get into that one device or that one virtual image, he now has access to maybe look at all of the secrets within your secret store, because that's how the developer deployed that specific identity for that server. And so that assumption of roles and access can go far beyond the user being able to get to an entitlement. It's that user being able to get access to things that also have rights to certain areas.
Yeah, like your server example, your VM example, like in the clouds, you can assign an identity. So you can assign an identity to a VM. And if we look back to, a rather well-known breach that happened a couple of years ago, the attacker made their way in and they got the identity from the box. So they didn't even log into the box themselves. They didn't even log into it. They were able to grab the identity from the box, and then they were able to use that identity to hop through. And this is what we call sort of how lateral movement happens in the cloud. It doesn't necessarily happen via the network, via servers anymore. You can jump laterally through identities. And guess what? No network tool is ever going to see that. And that identity that was sitting on that VM happened to have either direct access or through this lateral movement, access to very sensitive data. And they just ran an API call and did a sync of data out of the environment. And not a single network tool caught the initial exploit, the identity being used, the lateral movement, the sync and the sync out. It was all done, as I like to say, sort of at the cloud layer, and not a single tool saw that until somebody reported that there was terabits of really sensitive data sitting not where, definitely not where it shouldn't be, right?
Yeah, and that ties in pretty well with our initial keynote when we were talking about APIs. You know, APIs themselves, they have identities and what they have access to. And a
Yep.
compromised API can potentially open up to access to items that you may not intend, right? And that
Yep.
again goes back to that non-person identity that I think is it's important to understand, especially as companies are putting together these identity programs or maturing their identity program to be able to fully capture like what is the risk, how can these things happen, how my separation of duties that I think might be pretty well locked down because I do have a PAM in place and because my identity provider may be Active Directory Azure AD, but then they're missing that entire component of how their cloud stuff is deployed.
Exactly, right. And it comes back to where do we always start in information security is the inventory, the visibility. You
Mhm.
know, I think organizations, especially coming from the data center to the cloud, have good visibility into they've got AD, they've got an LDAP, they've got a whatever. They can see all of those user accounts and they can see the service accounts because they've been doing it for probably decades, that process. And maybe they can see the odd non-person identity in the cloud. But what I find is they don't know the full inventory of all the identities in their cloud. And that's a huge first step. But you know, once you get there, then you need to be able to, like I said, be able to determine the effective permissions or the end-to-end permission of every single one of those identities and compute them to see what they can actually do. And that's very difficult. I mean, I know, real world story here. I know one organization I work with that tried to do that, and they were doing it sort of think of a large boardroom conference room with spreadsheets and sticky pads mapping out identities to try to map their end to end. And it took them 3 months to get through all their identities. And I kind of felt bad for them. And I didn't say it at the time, but I was like, that's amazing work. And I'm glad that you actually like understand the problem and tried to solve it in a cool way. However, you were probably wrong 5 minutes after you started. Some developer probably popped a new identity in and you don't have that in your inventory anymore because you started, or somebody changed something somewhere along the way over the 3 months and that identity that you're reporting had access to nothing. Oh geez, someone gave Michael access to all of our sensitive data through a misconfiguration. And so, those are some of the problems that we're seeing. And then what happens as a security professional, you're reporting that everything's good and you truly believe it is because you only can go on what you know, but it's not. And so you kind of like, oh yeah, everything's great. And then you're not watching over there and then something happens and then you're like, then you have to explain, well, you told me everything was good. What happened over here? And in some cases, because you don't have the inventory, you don't have the ability to see what these things are doing, you also don't have the ability to see the actions that they're taking. So I might not ever know that Michael did an assume role, hopped into a service principal in Azure, grabbed a bunch of data, synced it out of the environment. I probably don't even see that. And like I said, your traditional security tools will not see that either.
Yeah, and I think that brings up a broader point about like onboarding and offboarding, right? When you're being able to, configure these cloud service providers, you're either doing a single sign-on or you're creating an account, and a lot of that, if you're not doing it in an automated manner, can leave these accounts, these accesses open for quite some time, and even for people that may not be in your business anymore. And
Yep.
so to be
Yeah.
able to automate in a way to understand inventory, track out to see, okay, well, we did offboard Eric because he was a bad employee, but he still has access to everything within AWS. And so how would you be able to provide that assurance back to the business that yes, this is what we have. These are the only avenues of getting access, and we can actually map that out in a way that provides the assurance that things are actually happening.
Yeah, and I think if we start then peeling the onion on that thought, you now bring it into the cloud and you start talking about your non-people identities. What do I see happen is that, a lot of this governance has drifted away from a centralized team. And so you've got these DevOps teams doing what they're doing, they're using these identities, they're configuring them, they're building them, they're using them to do what they need to do. But, no fault to their own, they're not really incentivized to be the IAM expert to lock it down. They're truly incentivized to get that thing out the door in whatever the length of their sprint is. And that's how they're measured. And
Mhm.
so, and they're not operations people. Like I had this joke about, dev and a little ops. These are smart developers that don't have a lot of traditional operational experience. Again, not in their wheelhouse necessarily. So, how do you get your workload working? Just grab, well, he created that identity over there. I'm just going to clone that or make or use it or make a copy of that. And I'm going to use it for my workload. And guess what? I hit the deadline because my workload works. Again, true real world story that I've seen. And you start to say, well, great, all you got 8 workloads and you guys are awesome and you did a great job, but like everything seems to work. And then as a security person, you're kind of like, that's a bit weird. And you dig into it and you find out that this workload is using this identity that's got full permissions. You're like, oh my God, of course it works. That's why. And then you go to the next one and you're like, and you see the same thing. And you go to the next one and you see the same thing. And you check all 8 of them and you see the same thing. And you're like, well, how did this happen? They're like, well, so and so that worked here 3 years ago that created the first workload used this identity and it worked. So I just used it, or I just made a copy of it and used it. And then someone said, then I like, oh, well, I went to another team and I used it over there. And what was happening was they weren't they were just using it like an asset and just passing it around. It's like making copies of your keys for everybody is essentially what they did. And so when it comes back to the governance of it, it's really like even if you're a small company, even if it's one person half of the time, having a team and a process around identity governance in the cloud. So if a developer needs an identity to do something, they kind of come to you and you vend that identity out. Now, speed and scale of the cloud, you can't be expected them to log into the console to do that. Use the automation tools like you're saying, Michael, that you have, but you need that governance around these identities. And that way you can ensure that they're doing it right. And you can set up things like patterns, like this application needs access to this, so the identity should look like that. I'll give a unique one over here. But organizations have to start thinking about identity governance in the cloud and specifically around non-people identities. And then, like you said, Michael, please use automation. That's why the cloud is so awesome. That's why the cloud is, we use it, we love it. Security and operations teams have to start using, especially security teams, have to start leveraging the automation that makes the cloud great, as opposed to being afraid of it and saying, well, what happens if I break something? Okay, what happens if you break something? Well, at least you know you broke it and where you broke it and how you broke it. What happens if you leave it to the DevOps team and they give a full permission to a workload and data goes out the window? I know which trouble I'd rather be in, to be honest.
It's good to hear that human behavior never really changes, because that scenario that you talked about, that's something that on-prem has been dealing with for years, right? The application worked because the Surface account had domain admin rights. Well, of course it did.
Yeah,
It can do everything and anything it wants to
yeah,
do. So it's thought and logic that's already been kind of defined on the on-premise side to say, look, we don't want to give everything domain admin rights. We don't want to have God rights. We want to give it the exact rights that it needs for that workload, that service, that system to be successful, as well as people identities, right? We don't want to be able to
yeah,
give the help desk people domain admin rights. We don't want to give them, global admin rights. We want to give them exactly what they need to do their job, not thinking that everyone's going to do nefarious things, but there's a potential for that account being compromised or that
yeah,
user potentially doing something bad. And you don't want that to become the vector for how your environment was compromised. And we've seen with a lot of different, hacks out there, compromises out there, where the identity was first and foremost. That's how they got in. They use a phishing campaign, they use a smishing campaign. They got that user to click on the MFA logon on their phone because they're just numb to it at this point, and it was a valid account is what they were used to
yep,
go through the environment. And not having that visibility of what that account can actually do, not just on-prem, but in the separate cloud service providers that you're using, Google,
yep,
OCI, AWS, they all have to be tracked and monitored separately because there's a potential for bleed over, right? You get to a certain elevated right within one cloud service provider, you could potentially jump over to Google with the effective permissions.
yeah. And I'm just looking over here because I have it written down for something else I was preparing for. But you hit the nail on the head. It's like, you know, IBM did a study a couple of years ago, and the stat that always sticks in my mind around the cloud is it's like 81% of all cloud breaches had to do with an identity. 81%. So of all the breaches that happened and all the research that they did, 81% of it had to do with an identity. And you can see how the whole risk picture has shifted in that way. But the beauty about the cloud, I mean, you mentioned really early on when we started talking about cost. The beauty about the cloud is because they charge you for everything, you can see everything that's happening with the right tooling. So getting to least privilege used to be really difficult in the data center because you had to do monitoring and asking people and all these other things. In the cloud, you can actually watch, again, with the right tooling, you can watch the actions that an identity is taking. And so, for an example, like what we do is, I'm meaning me as a CISO is like, you look at the action, you have an identity that's out there, you think it's at least privilege, and you just watch it and you baseline it. And you see that, okay, it's got, let's say, 10 permissions. Its entitlement set. And so you feel that that's what that application needs. That's what the developer said that they need. They need access to this, to that, blah, 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 whatever. And we monitor it. And then we said, well, wait a minute. In a month of running, you only used 3 of those actions. Like you only made three calls of this thing. And you said you needed 10. You don't actually need 10. You only need 3. And so the cloud actually has all the ability for security teams to solve these problems in much more sophisticated ways and much better ways. But it all comes back to you need the ability to do that inventory and you need the ability to see what they're doing. But if you can do that, there's fantastic solutions out there that can do that for you.
Yeah, the visibility that you get with the cloud is great because just like you were talking about, understanding that known trusted baseline to identify the deviations. We know that this is the developer built this greenfield, we just deployed it, we know what it's supposed to be doing, but then we see what it is doing, right? And we're able
Yep.
to lower the risk profile because now we don't need to give it all of that access. And
Yep.
then if we see it trying to do something else that wasn't within that known trusted baseline, that's a potential IOC, and we need to go do the
Yep.
investigation, find out what's going on. It could be something simple like, well, they pushed a new capability, but you wouldn't know that without first getting to the logs to see like something else happened.
Yeah, and I talk about like risk and incident, right? We as security professionals want to catch it at the risk, not at the incident. So having the
Mhm.
ability to understand, so say inventory your identities, then you compute their effective or end-to-end permissions. And then when you look at all of them, you see the risks. You can build a risk profile of all the identities. So you have the potential to detect a risk before anything happens. Also with the cloud, because you can track the actions and a good tool will help you with that. If you happen to miss the risk, then you really need to be looking for the action, like you said. And so it's all there. Teams just need to sort of shift their paradigms and thinking to sort of get the initial building blocks in place. And then they can start to do all these wonderful things. And then guess what? I'm going to get back on my soapbox of automation. Don't send a ticket to some guy that's buried in tickets. If that identity does something it's not supposed to do, run a piece of automation to shut it down. Again, would you rather be in trouble for taking something you thought was the right decision on something that shouldn't be happening? Or would you rather have to answer to why data just went out the window 2 weeks ago?
Yeah, and that concept of risk is really what drives a lot of the business decisions anyway.
Yep.
To be able to go up and ask for budget, you need to be able to showcase like, hey, here's the risk if we continue going this current path. Here's the potential fallout if that risk is realized in either in dollars and time or potential
Yeah.
PR issues. So having that visibility and the ability to say, look, we know that this system identity, this user identity can do these things. So here's the potential risk for doing that. And now you can start to walk it back. Okay, here are the steps that we can do to lower that risk. But again, it all comes back to the visibility, be able to understand what these
Yep.
users are, these identities are able to do. And I think that's critical because again, if we're trying to deploy to a lot of the buzzwords like zero trust, right? All of that comes to back to the identity. If you don't trust that identity, all
Yep.
the other capabilities that you're building into it are just going to fall flat because then
Yep.
anybody can use anything.
And I think too, like when we talk about identities, we've been talking about like users and roles and stuff, but there's things like access keys that get created and just sit around. And there's this whole hygiene piece around identities that's not happening as well. I mean, we're talking a lot in this conversation about identities that are in use, but really a lot of the risk comes from identities that are not in use. Somebody created a role and then didn't use it, but it's still active in the system. So somebody with the right access could then go use that role. Someone created an access key and doesn't use it, and but it's not been used, but it's still active. Well, all it takes is for someone to get that access key. So there's a lot, back to the inventory thing. There's a lot of risk you can first understand and then reduce very quickly that low hanging fruit with the right visibility. But again, I still see a lot of organizations focused on the user, what we used to call the account. Well, we've got this tool that shows us all of our users and our service accounts, so we're good. And this is where I see them getting in trouble. It's like, well, okay, but I'm in your cloud right now and I can see that you have 5,000 non-person identities. Did you know that? Oh, no, we only knew about the five really, really important ones. What do you deem important? Oh, full admin. Oh, okay, because of the 5,000 of them that I see, 2,500 of them actually have full admin. Did you know about those? And they're like, no, I didn't. Right? Did you know that some of them are 90 days old, some of them are 180 days old? Hey, look, there's one that's been up for 2 years. Did you know about that? And all of those things are risk that they're completely invisible to.
Right.
And that's why we talk about needing to shift the paradigm.
And that's that's just an item that we come back to constantly within security is the asset and inventory, right? You
Yeah.
can't protect what you don't know about. And so, again, with these identities, yes, knowing where they are and understanding the assumed path that they can take to be able to get to something, but then also kind of understanding what they have access to, or what you've maybe given access to. What you talked about with those keys, right? Those keys may be in a text file sitting in an exposed S3 bucket, right? So that configuration is allowing anybody to get access to it. So that's not an account that you may be tracking, but that's still access within your cloud environment that you need to be able to have visibility into.
Yeah. Yeah. And then to know if something happens with it. If you're not
Yeah,
even aware of it, how are you going to be able to know that something happened with it? Right.
yeah, that's the biggest thing. So we don't have any questions. So anybody that's here, if you have any questions or concerns or comments, please throw them up in the chat or Q&A. We'd love to address them. So, how have you been able to help companies kind of understand that overall risk? We've talked a little bit about providing some visibility and being able to do that inventory, but are there specific processes that the company can put in place to be able to start to grab that information, or are we purely still in the tool set because of just the swath of information that's available within the cloud?
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, again, it comes back to I always say, having identity and data security at the core of your cloud security strategy. And I tend to think in this way: is we talked a lot about identity inventories. You need something that can go in and natively into the cloud. Grab the identities, understand what they are, get a good picture of all of your identities across all of your cloud environments. But really, the key to that, the heart of that, it's great knowing. You have to have something that can compute the effective permissions or the end-to-end permission of an identity. You need to be able to understand those risky identities that, hey, Michael, the user in dev, can actually jump into prod and access sensitive data and do a delete, do a modify, do a sync, do a whatever. That's key. You have to understand those identities. So inventory them, determine their effective permissions. Then you have to sort of tie that to the data. What data can they access, and then what can they do with it? And that sort of forms your identity risk picture. At the same time, if you look at it, the flip side of that coin is the data. Inventory where your data is. Classify your data so you know which stuff you really care about and which stuff you don't care about. Did sensitive data move from production to development? And then right where the identity comes into play is what identities have access to that data? What can they do with that data? The risk. And if you can, what are they doing with that data, and should they be? And that really has to be at the core of your cloud security. Because what I see is, and I totally get it. I've been doing this my whole career. I see organizations that shift to the cloud, but they're still looking at things like vulnerabilities and on a VM, and maybe their posture management of their cloud, which are all great things to look at. But in the cloud, there's just so many things and it moves at such a speed. The way I talk about it is you have to put the risk in context. And again, okay, you could have a VM that's attached to the internet there's your configuration, your CSPM, your misconfiguration there, and that might have a vulnerability on it. Okay, so there's probably a lot of things with vulnerabilities on it attached to the internet, and you've got a small team and a small budget, and there's thousands of these things. How do you quickly determine the one thing you need to focus on? Okay, what is an identity on that VM? Yes. What does it have access to? It has access to sensitive data. What can it do? Oh shoot, it can sync that all out of my environment. Now you've just taken thousands of problems and narrowed it down into probably the one problem your team has. So you need to like think about those four pillars of, you know, what we call posture management in the cloud, or configuration management, and vulnerability stuff, which everybody's aware of. Tie it together with the identities, tie it together with the data piece. I call that getting your risk in context. And now you have one thing your team can focus on. That's really what I spend a lot of my time, working with CISOs and working with organizations on how to put those types of things together. Because if not, if you're looking at each one of them in silos, you might miss the picture and not good things happen.
You touched on an important part, that data aware capability and data classification to be able to, articulate, hey, this data here, social security numbers, PII, HIPAA, whatever, that's an important thing that we need to track. In some of these tool sets, they can just tell you, hey, this identity has access to S3 buckets or has access to this Azure blob. That's great and something that we actually need to address. But to be able to provide that elevated risk of like, it can get to this blob and this blob has, HIPAA data.
Yes.
So that's something we absolutely need to lock down, because there are ramifications for somebody getting access to that.
Yeah, like from a risk and governance perspective, that's how you form your risk measure, right?
Mm.
If Michael has access to bucket A and blob B, how am I supposed to know which one of those is where the risk is? You got to know what is in that thing. I always tell the analogy of I was working with an organization, and I was working for an organization, and I went in and they were in the cloud and they held some really sensitive data. And I said, okay, can anybody tell me where our sensitive data is in our cloud right now? And smart people, they got up, they drew the architecture on the board from memory. It was brilliant. It was like, oh my God, how can you keep that all in your head? And it was the full architecture of the cloud. And they're like, the data's here. I was like, no, that's where the data is supposed to be. How do you know the data is not over there in some developer sandbox? And so that's where this data tracking, this classification becomes really important. And the same applies to, we talked about a little bit is vulnerabilities. Everybody's familiar with vulnerability management. We all still do it, but you've got thousands and thousands of resources in your cloud, even in a data center. I was in one company once, we had like 20,000 high vulnerabilities. It's like, what am I supposed to do with that? So, if you're only looking at vulnerabilities on their own, it's just this onslaught of noise. It's like, okay, what am I supposed to do with that? But if you can say, I've got a system with a vulnerability, and it might not even be a critical or a high, it might be a medium, but still vulnerability, and it's attached to the internet. And then when you bring the identity and data piece into it, it's got an identity with access to really sensitive data. You've just taken, again, something that could be 20 out of 20,000 vulnerable systems. You've just identified the one system that you probably need to shoot the flares up and say, whoa, we need to fix this. That's also sort of the story of the breach I alluded to earlier. That's sort of how it happened, right? So
Yeah, there's plenty of percentages out there as far as like growth of data. We're creating something like a petabyte a day of something, some
yeah,
ridiculous number, but all of it comes down to being able to have that data classification, right? For somebody
yep,
somewhere, some program to have said, yes, I've defined this as, private information, HIPAA information, financial information, and having that program within the company to be able to consistently go back and, uh, you know, tag that data, put the metadata in that says this is what's in here, or have tools on the back end that can scan and tell you, hey, just like your scenario, this is where the data should be living, but everybody else is working on this data over here. And I found that by, some type of tool or some type of scan or some type
yep,
of tag that said, this is your HIPAA data. Were you aware of it? And I think it all kind of boils down to, the identity aspect. Who has
yep,
access to what? Did that person need to have access to that other S3 bucket to put it there? No. Well, that's something else
yeah,
you can do to tighten down your
yeah.
configuration and
Or,
ensure that people are going the right way.
or do we know that that VM had access to it? Or do we know that that cloud service had access to it? When I come back to the whole lateral movement, back in the day in the data center, adversaries, we used to move, we used to move laterally. You'd get on a box and you'd traverse the network. You'd follow the network to get from spot to spot to spot. So we as security teams basically used networks as our boundaries and then put our tracking tools in those around those boundaries and whatever to watch the network traffic. Lateral movement in the cloud really happens through identities these days. And it's, like I said, I'm the user Michael. I can assume a role and now I'm a different identity, which gives me access to this stuff over here, which allows me to jump a cloud. That attacker is moving laterally through a path that you're not tracking very likely. And so we have to think too about how adversaries are moving laterally in our cloud to get from where they start to where they need to get. And that's a big thing in identities that I spend a lot of time, working with organizations on understanding that thinking. And I think if there's one thing that I hope people walk away with today is lateral movement in the cloud has to do with identities. And you probably don't have the tools to even catch it right now.
So just notice that Lonnie has a question. What do you see as the pros and cons of being either single or multi-cloud for identity? I think it comes down to what risk are you trying to solve when you're putting that, going after that certain structure, right? If you're saying, here's my identity store, it's going to be in Azure AD, it's going to be in Ping, it's going to be in Okta, whatever the case may be. What are you trying to solve by doing that, right? If you're trying to split up an identity, say, well, I'm going to use Ping for AWS, or I'm going to use AWS's built-in identity capabilities or secret store. Again, it's not something you can cleanly answer, because you can be completely successful with one single cloud and
Yep.
one single cloud service provider. But, Eric, what's your take on that?
Well, I mean, I think if I look at it from a business perspective, and I'll use another example of a customer of ours, they've got this wonderful setup where they're multi-cloud and their whole front end stuff is Amazon, and their back end compute and they do a lot of data compute is GCP. And so they just find themselves in this multi-cloud IAM position because you have identities in one cloud, you have identities in another cloud. This is how it works, and they have to talk across. So to the business, that configuration is wonderful. Their product is awesome. It's a fantastic product for that reason. The cons are now you've got two clouds to inventory in. You've got two clouds to compute your effective permissions or your end-to-end permissions in. And then you layer on top of that, now you have to be able to compute the permissions across your clouds. So you might use a tool over here and you might use a tool over there, and they might not even be that great. You definitely don't have a tool that ties it together. That can be a big con. And a lot of times the security teams don't really have much of a say. They just say, hey, we've got this great workload that works in this way. It uses multi-cloud. And you're like, oh, okay. So, it, like everything else, it all comes down to a risk-based decision and what you're trying to achieve as a business. But I think the biggest con is just, again, consistent inventory, consistent view across all clouds can be very difficult without the right tooling in place.
We have another question from Chris. Can you talk about how serverless and containers have complicated the cloud identity and entitlement management challenge?
Yeah, I mean, all of these things have identities of their own. Serverless has, talk about Amazon, for example, or Microsoft, you can assign an identity to a Lambda function. So now you've just created a role that can be used for something. So what happens if that role is over permissioned and Michael Brewer can access that Lambda function and use it in a way that wasn't intended? I did a research paper a couple of years ago where with only like 3 permissions, I, as the user Eric, in an environment that I had built, could create a Lambda function that could then call IAM that could then grant the user Eric admin privileges. And I only had 3 or 4 permissions. So it greatly complicates it in that way. It extends the inventory of the things you need to look at. It makes computing those effective permissions really, really hard. And if I bring it right back to bare metal here, a lot of organizations aren't even thinking about that. They're still focused over here on their users. So right from the get-go, just the ability to have those things in your environment and not fully understand how they work creates a ton of problems that you're probably not aware of.
All right. I don't see any other questions. So what else do you think would be important for the attendees to know about cloud identity and capabilities to be able to secure their environments?
I mean, first and foremost, we've talked a lot about the risks and the need to inventory and calculate the effective permissions and understand that. I mean, I think that's huge. But if I can leave anything tangible, what I recommend and consult to organizations is, even if it's a person, a half a person, have a team, and I'm using air quotes here. It doesn't have to be 10 people, and a process in by which you govern your identities. You've got a DevOps team that's using them. Have a team where they come to them in a process where they can request an identity, and you can create the identity in a way, manually, automation, however you want to do it, that at least is a little more least privileged than wide open, and that you have the right tooling to monitor those identities and what they're doing to determine, one, did the least privilege we give it, can it be even less privilege? And number two, once you've established your baseline, are there identities that are trying to basically deviate from your baseline, and those become your security incidents? And the key to that is, you can't be doing it every 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. This has to be done continuously, because I've seen one change happen where a completely locked down identity in a development account, because someone messed up in a completely different account, through the effective permission, gave that identity access to sensitive data in their cloud. And if you were monitoring, so what happened was, they did it, they made the change, a day went by, someone realized, and they backed the change out. If you're polling, every 30 days to make sure you're at least privilege, you've just missed that whole problem. And in that case, nothing bad happened, but that's when the bad stuff happens. And you would have never seen that. You would have said, on day one, we're fine. On day 31, we're fine. And in the middle, someone could have just crashed and grabbed your data. So, people, process, and technology, I think, is the big takeaway.
Yeah, the speed of cloud, like we talked about earlier, to be able to hit whatever you're delivering within your sprint window. That's how we need to be able, from security point of view, keep up. Right? If they're doing stuff every 2 weeks, at a minimum, we need to be looking at it every 2 weeks. If they're deploying stuff on a daily basis, which a lot of these DevSecOps pipelines are allowing these things to do, we also need to be right there at their hip, knowing these changes and be able to provide that risk scoring back to the business to say, look, this is what they're doing, and this is how we're exposed or not exposed, right? And provide
Yeah.
that assurance that things are being done how they should be.
And it allows you as a security professional to talk about risk to your leadership in a way that's appropriate too. Instead of being chicken little, it's like, oh my God, that's crazy. With the right tools in place, with the ability to do things we've been talking about, you can put a risk picture together. This is a risky application because it can do X, Y, and Z. Maybe
Mhm.
we need to do something about it. And that's how you're going to get your programs funded, other than just saying, well, I think we have a problem, because that doesn't get you any budget.
Yeah, no one wants to be Chicken Little saying, "Well, we can't do that," right? From a security point of view, we want to be able to be the ones to enable things to get done
Yep.
at a lower risk and securely. So,
Yeah.
well, Eric, I truly appreciate your time today. Thank you very much for this conversation. I thought it was pretty informative, and hopefully our attendees did as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Michael, and thanks everybody for joining. Off of this, if anybody's got any questions, just look me up on LinkedIn. I'm happy to chat with anybody. I'm not a salesperson too. I'll throw that out there. I'm just a CISO that's trying to help other people in this community. So feel free to reach out to me.
That's awesome. I truly appreciate it, Eric. Take care, sir.
Have a good one. Bye.
Bye.